In my previous, rather introductory video on Wagner, I made passing reference to Theodor Adorno, professor of the Frankfurt School and master of critical theory, and his scholarly piece In Search of Wagner. This video and the next will discuss and analyze that work. Before I begin in earnest, I'm obliged here to make several disclaimers. The first is that In Search of Wagner was originally written in German, which I cannot speak. The translation I'm referencing was done by Rodney Livingston for New Left Books in 1981. And this edition of the translation dates to 2005. There may well be moments in which my responses to Adorno's critiques are predicated on a reading of the English translation which, were I engaging with the original text, might be quite different, if not invalidated. In a similar vein, I must disclaim that in engaging with this work at all, I am on ground which is not perfectly solid. I feel myself to be on comfortable footing in questions of musicology. Regularly I find Adorno's analysis entirely valid, and bewildering only in the polarity of his opinion on the work being analyzed. But In Search of Wagner extends far beyond musical mechanics. It is a syncretic essay, combining music theory most notably with critical theory, and this is critical theory in perhaps its purest form, expressed by one of the greatest men of the Frankfurt School. More than that, however, Adorno was thoroughly learned in music history, particularly in regards to opera. He has at his disposal also a comprehensive education in continental philosophy, beginning at least with German idealism, and even a working knowledge of 19th century artistic movements beyond music. In all these fields, I must profess inadequacy. As far as is possible, I will contend in this video only with the musicology, and in the next with the Marxism, although Adorno is not inclined to preserve that name in his critical theory. Therefore, these videos cannot claim to be an exhaustive analysis, or indeed a chapter-by-chapter summary of In Search of Wagner. My final disclaimer is that there exists in this work an extremely clear animus from Adorno towards Wagner. The reasons for this are abundantly obvious to anyone who knows a thing or two about either man, but this animus is not subtext. I am not drawing it out of a paragraph which hints at this, or a sentence which alludes to that. It is essentially the thesis of the first chapter of the book. The disclaimer here is that I will not contend with this animus, or the question underpinning it, at all. There are considerably more interesting questions in this work to address, but I feel it would be irresponsible to fail to acknowledge this conflict underpinning the whole thing. The 2005 edition of In Search of Wagner begins with a foreword by Slavoj Zizek, which perfectly encapsulates the power of the essay. Zizek writes, "For the first time, the Marxist reading of a musical work of art as a cipher of social antagonisms was combined with and grounded in the highest musicological analysis." Leaving aside one petty dispute I have with the parenthetical, this is perfectly correct. Adorno's critique contains theoretical analyses at every level of composition, from the broadest possible principles from which a work is built, to the very effect created by this note placed just here, to the temporal qualities of Wagner's preferred orchestration. These theoretical analyses are also largely unimpeachable, although Adorno's tendency to editorialize his analysis certainly is not. Nonetheless, I do not feel any particular need to quarrel with each of Adorno's opinions on Wagner's preferred technique. I wish instead to summarize those musical qualities Adorno identifies as critical to an understanding of Wagner's work, regardless of his personal opinions of those qualities, which I intend to expand upon in the next video. To comprehend the approach Adorno takes to analyzing Wagner, it is first necessary that I butcher the German word Gesamtkunstwerk, translating approximately to total work of art. Wagner used the expression himself, and study of him has long used this term to describe his operas and indeed his philosophy as an artist. The creator of the Gesamtkunstwerk might be described in modern terms as a sort of proto-auteur. In the century before film, Wagner was Scorsese. Now, this distinction is aesthetic and philosophical, not musicological, but I promise the musicology proceeds from the philosophy, and the preamble is actually important. Adorno's critique of Wagner as a composer rather than as a man begins in the second chapter, Gesture. After some introduction detailing Wagner's dilettantism, which is an interesting argument in itself, Adorno arrives at his first properly musically substantive criticism, and it's of the use of Leitmotif. In his words, among the functions of the Leitmotif can be found, alongside the aesthetic one, a commodity function, rather like that of an advertisement. Anticipating the universal practice of mass culture later on, the music is designed to be remembered, it is intended for the forgetful. He also writes, the marks it leaves on the work are the pretentious pieces of incidental music that punctuate it, flourishes, signals, and fanfares. Embedded in this observation on Leitmotif, and rather difficult to get away from, are Marxian assumptions about mass culture. But the observation is valid nonetheless, and it arises from a perspective that Wagner's motifs are the byproduct of the absolute domination of the composer's will, and the whole effect the composer intends to create. Adorno makes reference to complaints about Wagner's melodic weakness, and he attributes this perceived weakness to the absolute primacy of the whole orchestration, without so obvious a melodic line. The leitmotif, then, is the element which breaks up the massive effect of the semi-melodic style. I see no reason to dispute the thrust of Adorno's point here. There are clear exceptions. For perhaps the most famous example, it would very much be splitting hairs to describe Ride of the Valkyries as melodically weak, but it is the case that Wagner regards melodic primacy as the exception rather than the rule. In those dominating segments of Wagner's orchestration, then, those overtures and interludes when the orchestra has a massive sound, what is the real effect of the leitmotif in those moments? As Adorno writes, if the capacity for musical understanding is equated, broadly speaking, with the ability to remember and anticipate, then the old anti-Wagner slur that he was writing for the unmusical can be said to have a certain critical justification. Adorno's point here is in fact elitist and is framed as such, although Adorno throws the responsibility for his elitism on some critics of old, not himself. The leitmotif is a sort of grounding point for the work, something which a theoretical musical neophyte can experience and process without much hassle, that they can perhaps hum to themselves after the opera has finished. This understanding of leitmotif is entirely reasonable and is partly why I chose to do a video on it. For viewers who watched my video on leitmotif, you will recall that I mentioned in the Flying Dutchman Overture how the use of the Dutchman's motif repeatedly signified a change in the direction of the music. This becomes, as you listen, something which the listener can easily predict. There is indeed a profound accessibility to it, but to editorialize, it does not seem to me that this is any sort of weakness, although it is, to give Adorno his due, an unsubtlety. Jumping ahead now, a few chapters to chapter 5, which Adorno titles Color. The core musicological concept discussed here seems on the surface unrelated to the previous discussion of leitmotif. They do, however, intersect under the auteur ideal of Gesamtkunstwerk. Color here is the word Adorno uses to describe timbre, but he's talking about timbre in the broadest sense, the timbre realized by the instrumentation of the entire orchestra. It's here that Adorno is kindest, by far, to Wagner. He opens the chapter saying, "Whereas Wagnerian harmony swings between past and future, the dimension of color is, properly speaking, his own discovery. Each work of Wagner's had its own combination of instruments, its own orchestral style." This chapter, I believe, is the height of Adorno's musicological analysis of Wagner, although I must confess to a bias in that it is also the chapter where Adorno must essentially admit Wagner's genius. It is in chapter 5 where we find the longest analyses of the work alone, the longest without, that is, some interrupting Marxian theory, which I find to be quite out of place. Consider this passage. Any loss in individual timbre sustained by the single instrument as a result of doubling is made up for by the possibility of smooth integration with the orchestra as a whole. Obviously, this gestures at the Gesamtkunstwerk, and the suppression of individuation in the face of the will of the composer is something I will discuss in the next video. But I'd like to mention here something which isn't clear without the full context of the book. At almost all times in every chapter, Adorno is mixing musicology with critical theory, as Zizek mentions in the foreword. In chapter 5, Adorno goes about 6 pages with absolutely distilled musicology before segueing by way of personal attack to critical theory. This cannot be explained, given Adorno's previous diligence in interweaving critical theory with his analysis, by anything but a sheer intellectual fascination with Wagner's timbral technique. And it's here where I must actually endorse In Search of Wagner to a serious Wagner enthusiast. Though at times difficult to stomach, Adorno reveals now and again the depth and care with which he is capable of treating the musical subject, and that is delightful to read. I should now like to synthesize the two elements I've pulled out of Adorno's critique and contextualize them somewhat further. The use of leitmotif and the precise control over orchestral color both serve the Gesamtkunstwerk, the first in fixing the attention of the audience on just the thing the composer wishes him to notice, and the second in making that thing you're meant to notice absolutely flawless. Adorno will write further in chapter 5 of Wagner's desire to emancipate sound from the modes of its production. A decidedly Marxian phrasing, but essentially correct, as the holistic effect at which Wagner aims is fundamentally transcendent. He does not want traces of the individual performer in the sound any more than he wants too definite and dominant a melody to conquer the work. Leitmotif is permitted to ground the composition in time, but is never made dominant over it. To generalize further still, and even perhaps to overstep myself, Wagner's sensibility regarding orchestration has become almost common today, notably to musicians seemingly far removed from the traditions of opera and symphony orchestra. Now, Adorno does make reference to the use of leitmotif in film and other modern media. But what I'm interested in is the influence of Wagner, that is, the influence of that same preference which drove his orchestration, in modern forms of ambient music, from contemporary classical composers like Max Richter, to shoegazing guitarists like Kevin Shields, to electronic tone wizards like Taicho. Liberated from the supremacy of melody, these artists find themselves capable of exploring timbre, color, and the texture of sound in ways Wagner could not have predicted in his time, but in ways that Wagner may well have presaged. The time I've spent on discussing Wagner's use of color should by no means be taken as a suggestion that as a composer, he was merely a sculptor of sound. Although Adorno may prefer you believe this, it's clearly not the case. There is a reason that even today, every citizen of the mal-educated West knows the bridal chorus from Lohengrin, although they may not know that they know it. I highlight this aspect of Wagner only as it is a musicological element which Adorno finds himself entirely unable to dismiss, and which indeed he seems at moments sincerely passionate about. Is the use of color Wagner's unique genius then, the critical element which raises his work above his contemporaries? I don't particularly think so, but then I'm inclined to believe that the X factor of Wagner's work is simply his desire to will an aesthetic totality into being, as Adorno puts it. That will, and Adorno's reaction to it, will be further discussed in the next video. Lehitraut for now.